I mean. I'm referring to this famous quote of Pablo Picasso, actually. Good artists borrow, great artists steal. Now, I am in no way comfortable calling myself a great artist, but I'm very happy to confess that I steal when it comes to my teaching style. And initially, I stole from who you'd think I'd steal from, like my best professors that I had as an undergrad and as a PhD. As I was a grad student, I'd watch the department colloquium every week. Whenever there was a particularly good talk, I would try to dissect it, say, what was it that made it so good? Is that something I can copy? Is that not something I can copy? As I've gotten older, I've actually started looking even more broadly of things to steal from. So my current obsession is stand-up comedians. Dave Chappelle, Wanda Sykes, Jared Carmichael. Actually, one thing that's been awesome about moving to New York is it's very easy to see stand-up live. But I also study the Netflix specials, especially these days for the use of rhetoric, the use of space, and of intonation. It's really, they have amazing techniques, that some of which I think is definitely stealable. So for today's talk, I decided to just come up with a few simple tricks that I use in my classroom that perhaps, some of you I'm sure already do them, but perhaps some of you will find something to steal. All right, so the first idea, teaching backwards. So let me actually give you 2 points of background here. Point number one, so I was an undergrad back in the mid-90s, and during that time I was a college radio DJ. So every week I'd spend 3 hours in a windowless basement room at Memorial Auditorium at Stanford, playing CDs and playing vinyl records. And like all DJs, I was totally obsessed with sequencing. Okay? Not just what songs will you play, but in what order and what will the segues be like between those songs. And to this day, that deeply influences how I think about my courses, both how I structure a single lecture and also how I structure the entire course. And so you'll see that in both of the first two points. Second point of background, when I was a first-year assistant professor, this was at Stanford in 2004, I was assigned the undergraduate algorithms course. Okay? I had to teach that. Courses were not as big in 2004 as they are now, but back then at Stanford, it still meant something like 120 people. Because it was required for everybody, all the bachelor students, all the masters, all the PhDs, had to take this class. And moreover, it was the most advanced class that was required for all of the BS majors, okay? And so it was I was pretty terrified, right? Because on the one hand, I felt like I was gonna be facing an audience, most of whom didn't really want to be there, or thought they didn't want to be there. And secondly, to teach algorithms well, and it's really the core of computer science, you have to do some non-trivial math. There's really just sort of no choice. And I really feel like to this day, a lot of aspects of my teaching style were sort of forged in the crucible of teaching that difficult required class back in my first year. And in particular, I sort of developed this mindset of kind of always needing to justify my existence. So, you can't teach this course without causing some pain to students doing some math. But so I aspired to always, before the pain was felt, it was crystal clear, why it needed to be endured and what would be the payoff of doing so. So in other words, math as a necessary evil en route to something which is obviously interesting to all computer scientists, like say the running time of some super cool algorithm like Quicksilver. Okay? So those are all points of background into teaching backward. Backward with respect to, if you open up, so we're going to teach sort of mathematical stuff. So I'm comparing to say how a math book is typically written or a theoretical computer science book is typically written. And in my experience, if you randomly sample such a book, it looks like the main goal of the author was to avoid offending their friends, who are also professional mathematicians, as opposed to thinking about the student experience. So for example, like a cardinal rule, right, in a math book is never use a term before it's defined. Right? Maybe a good idea for a book, even there I think it's debatable, but definitely a rule that should be broken in the classroom, in my experience. So again, as far as the ordering, of course you can't prove something before you've stated the theorem. That doesn't make any sense. And then usually, you go through a whole bunch of foundations, and then once you've mastered all the foundations, at that point, hopefully, there's a chapter on the applications, putting them to use. And so I said I'm obsessed with sequencing, so literally within a lecture, whenever I have a sequence of things like this to discuss, I always do a thought experiment. Would it be better for the students to do it in some other order? Like, for example, just in reverse. For the first one, I think it's almost always a good idea. Actually. So before introducing a mathematical definition, introduce things that are going to satisfy the definition, also introduce things that are not going to satisfy the definition. Students can then understand the definition as a natural extrapolation of the examples. And I found this almost always improves lecture when I do this. And when I first started doing it, it sort of felt like a sleight of hand, like it was just some cheat code that I discovered. But then as I got older, I realized, you talk to people who do math for a living, this is actually how they think about definition anyways. they do not think about the statement usually. They think about what they're intended to include and exclude. So this even feels more faithful to the practice of kind of doing mathematics. All right, this next one it's not always a good idea to reverse it, but sometimes it is, maybe 50-50. So sometimes what you've been discussing already naturally leads into a proof. Maybe you've done an example and you just say, what would a general version of this argument look like? And you start trying to generalize it. All of a sudden you say you need hypothesis A for this step, hypothesis B for this step. You finish, you're like, oh, okay, what did we just prove? And then out falls the theorem statement. Okay, some of the times that works out too. And then like I was saying, sort of math is a necessary evil. I always start with the application, and then when we have no choice but to do some theory, at that point we do the theory. So I know this is all kind of abstract, so let me show you kind of concretely, especially sort of this last point, how this would play out in one of my courses. Okay, so the next two slides are stolen from, they're literally the very beginning of my undergrad algorithms course. So these are from literally the first 10-minute video of the first of the two MOOCs, where I'm telling just sort of giving people a feel for algorithms and reminding people that everybody learned algorithms as a kid, like in 5th grade when you learn to just take the product of two numbers, right? A bunch of partial products and sum up the results. And in algorithms, in undergrad algorithms, what we really focus on is whether algorithms are fast or slow. In computer science, we usually care about big problems. So actually, we really focus on the scaling behavior of algorithms. So as the input grows larger, how much more time does it take for your algorithm to solve the problem? Okay? And if you stare at the 5th grade integer multiplication algorithm, you sort of see that there's this kind of, if the digits had n numbers, you have to fill out this roughly n by n table. And indeed, the number of operations for the 5th grade algorithm grows as a quadratic function of the number of digits in the integers. Okay? So in particular, if you wanted to look at numbers that were twice as long, the number of operations would grow by a factor of 4. Okay? Because you have this quadratic dependence. All right, so something you probably didn't think about in 5th grade is whether there might be an algorithm better than this one, meaning faster, meaning scaling more slowly with the input size. And it turns out there are such algorithms. And the first one you learn is something called Karatsuba multiplication. It is not important today that you sort of understand how this works. That's not the point. I will just say, for those of you that know a little programming, so it's a recursive algorithm, meaning it calls itself on smaller inputs with sort of fewer numbers. The most straightforward way to solve integer multiplication recursively arises, you have to make 4 recursive calls, solve 4 subproblems. Karatsuba noticed a very simple trick where you can reduce the number of recursive calls from 4 to 3. Okay, which surely speeds up the algorithm, but the question is, by how much? Okay? So at this point, the question is, does this crazy recursive algorithm, that I've just explained, does it beat what you did in 5th grade or not? Okay? And generally, everybody's pretty interested in that. And it's also clear you're going to have to do math to answer the question, because figuring out the running time of recursive algorithms is difficult. They spawn a bunch of copies of themselves, and you have to keep track of all of the work being done and all of the different recursive calls. This is kind of obvious you're going to need some math. Then later in the course, you do something known as the master method, which is this sort of powerful theorem for analyzing recursive algorithms like this. And already before you even start that, everybody sort of is wondering what actually is the running time of this. And maybe you do a little bit of a spoiler alert and you promise them it is going to be better than the 5th grade algorithm. The exact answer turns out to be it scales as n to the log base 2 of 3, n to the roughly 1.57 for those of you interested. Okay. So that's an example of how I really start with the application before I move on to the math. All right, so 2 other ideas, and I'll be quick with each of these. So idea 1, so when you have, when you're doing a 3-hour DJ set, one thing you always want to avoid doing is having a part that drags. Okay, so there should be sort of a nice narrative arc. There's going to be crescendos and climaxes and ebbs and flows, all sorts of things. Another analogy, which especially in the last decade I've really liked, is television series. Right? So the good ones, which you have a long narrative arc spanning sort of multiple seasons. I think of a course sort of as like a season, individual lectures sort of as like episodes. It's another analogy I like. And TV shows also, you don't want to drag. Okay, you got to maintain momentum. And in my experience, this is a pretty big factor of student engagement. Does it feel like you're on a crescendo building towards some climax, which is going to be worthwhile at the end of the day? All right, so I'm still trying to think about how to best convey a sense of momentum, but let me just tell you one thing that I always do, which is I try to let the length that I have in mind dictate the material, not the other way around. Okay, so I don't say I'm going to teach chapter 4 of this textbook, however long it takes. I say I'm going to teach topic X in this class. How much patience do I think the students have for topic X, assuming I give really good lectures? And the answer is generally going to be, might be, let's say, 2 lectures, okay? 1 week, 2.5 hours. And then I take that as a hard constraint. There's more than 2.5 hours worth of stuff I'd like to say about topic X, but I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to curate their experience. What is the best 2.5 hours of topic X I could possibly tell them that'd be the most useful later? This is hard. It forces you to make tough decisions kind of all along the way, but I think they're good tough decisions, right? So they're really forcing you to decide what to omit, right? To curate. And if you think about it, like, what do you want an expert Columbia professor for, if not to kind of curate exactly which parts of the subject you're going to learn, okay? Good. Now, so you can't be in a crescendo for 14 straight weeks, right? That doesn't work. You can't be in a crescendo for a 3-hour DJ set either. So there have to be ebbs and flows, right? There have to be, so I like to think about sort of alternating this crescendo to a climax followed by an interlude. And I mean this both at the time scale of within a single lecture and also across the entire course. And so within a lecture, this ties in nicely to the discussions we were having about sort of tidbits of active learning and that kind of thing. So, if I finish a hard proof, say it was like a 20-minute proof or something, and we finally finish it, I find some excuse to have the students rest for 5 minutes. And so, again, to give anything else, it's just a stretch break. Better would be, something about active learning. Or maybe I could tell them some historical context about what was going on at the time of this theorem. Maybe I can tell them some biographical facts about the people who proved it. Maybe they know the people who proved it. Maybe I know some sort of war stories from the trenches. In industry, people who have used this or related statements. Anything, really, almost any excuse to give the students a chance to regroup so you can start on the crescendo again. Okay. So that brings me to the last idea, which is yet another thing. Yet another type of interlude that I like to use, and again, this will echo some of the things that Katie said, which is do not be afraid of exposing your course's logic explicitly to the students. In other words, give them some insight, give them a view under the hood a little bit into the process of putting the course together or putting the various lectures together, the struggles you had, the design decisions you faced, etc., what your teaching philosophy is. If nothing else, the students are going to be reassured to hear that you have a teaching philosophy and that you actually thought about difficult decisions putting the course together. And again, echoing something that Katie said, I find that actually these interludes, I think it closes the gap between the students and the instructor. I think it makes it more clear it's kind of a cooperative endeavor, right? Rather than an antagonistic one. Okay, when you open up the box like this a little bit. Let me just give you one concrete example, like one interlude I like to use. I like to talk about the following completely stupid trivial equation. I tell students that the amount that they get out of the class, right, is going to be the amount of time they put into it times the rate of learning. Okay? Totally stupid equation. But here's the point of this factorization. I tell them, this term, this is my job. My job is to make this as high as possible. My goal is to make this higher than it's ever been for any course you've ever taken. Probably I won't succeed, but that's my aspiration. And then I say, ball's in your court, guys. This term, that's you. I have no control over it. Okay? You choose how much you want to spend, or equivalently, you choose how much you want to learn in this course. So those are the 3 tricks. So I'll stop there.